analysis part, which my expertise was a little lacking there, so she helped me out big time there, so big thank you to her. Also to Colonel Foster, who dragged me through his infamous research design for political science class. He couldn't be here today, but his class provided a lot of foundation for what you're going to see here today in my study. And lastly, to my mom for coming up from Lynchburg all the way, so hopefully I don't get roasted too bad in the Q&A after this. But, so without further ado, I'll go ahead and get started. The title of my study is Religious Integrationism and State Aggression. Kind of some fancy terminology, but basically what we're going to be looking at today is religion, states, and aggression sort of conflict. So the motivation for this study came from the fact, one, I'm an Arabic major, Middle Eastern Studies minor, so I'll look a lot at religion and conflict, and that's been big in the Middle East, of course, so that's what a lot of people think of as the Middle East. I'm going to be expanding way beyond the Middle East in this study. So that's kind of the first kind of impetus motivation. Second of all, through a lot of the 20th century, scholars thought that with the rise of globalization and modernization, basically societies became more advanced, and we as a people just became more advanced. We were basically just going to outgrow religion pretty much, so they thought there's a secularization theory that religion was just going to decline in general from the world, from international, domestic, personal life, and it was just going to slowly fade out. But what happened was, actually, religion made an unexpected return to the spotlight in the last few decades. And so you can see various ways religion has sort of played a role in various international and domestic issues, Islamic terrorism in the Middle East and Africa, Islamic revolutions, but also examples from outside the Middle East, Buddhist terrorism, persecution of various minority groups, religious minority groups around the world, for example in China, sort of conflicts between India and Pakistan relations. So religion has played a role in all these conflicts around the world. So we see that there is sort of a religious element to all of these issues, but the problem is for scholars, what they've really investigated is what exact role does religion play in these issues. So some have said that perhaps religion plays a role in these issues in the sense that it affects policy decisions. So policymakers, maybe they have particular religious beliefs. Maybe there are certain religious lobbyist groups that influence policymakers to make certain policy decisions. So that's one way religion could influence domestic and international issues. A second way religion might play a role here is sort of as a source of legitimacy for governments. So maybe governments claim to uphold a certain religious standard or belief system, and that gives them a sense of legitimacy in the eyes of maybe the people or other states. So this is kind of the bird's eye, broad view of how religion might fit into international and domestic affairs. Scholars have gone a little bit deeper, though, into how religion and conflict relate. So in particular, scholars have found that religion is associated with more frequent and more violent ethnic conflict within a given state. Second of all, that religion makes conflict last longer in general and makes it also more violent. And third, that close ties between religion and state, religious bodies, state institutions, that can increase the probability of a state's involvement in an international crisis, and it can affect the severity of the conflict as well. So this is what we know so far, mainly about religion and conflict, and here's what I'm going to be contributing through this study today. So, like I said, while some scholars have focused on ethnic conflict in the domestic setting, I'm going to be focused on interstate conflict, and interstate is just a term for state-on-state conflict, state versus state. Second of all, while some scholars have focused on this idea of how religion makes conflict last longer, makes it more violent or severe, I'm going to be focusing on the initiation of conflict and how states start conflicts and why they might do that. And third, I'm going to take this idea of religion-state connections, and I'm going to go a little bit deeper and focus on how the degree and type of religion-state connections might influence a state's behavior, particularly might make it more likely to be involved in a conflict. right, so all this research leads me to my research question, which is how does a state's relationship to religion affect its behavior towards other states? And in particular, does the degree of separation between religion and state lead the state to act more aggressively towards other states? So I'm going to answer that question in my theory, but before I get there, I want to define a few terms and concepts that will be necessary to understand exactly what my theory is saying. So there's two dimensions to this religion-state relationship. The first one is degree. Degree refers to the amount of separation between religious bodies and state institutions and their foundational legal authority. So, for example, a state that has a low degree of separation, that means that there are high religion-state connections. We call that state integrationist. Religion and state are very interconnected. However, if there's a high degree of separation between religion and state, we call that state differentiated. So that's degree. Now if we go to kind, kind has to do with how satisfied the majority of the people are, the population is with the current status quo of the terms of the current religion-state relationship. So if the people are generally happy with the status quo of the relationship between religion and state, we call that state consensualist. There's no tension there. However, if there's a low degree of satisfaction between the terms of the relationship between religion and state, we call that state conflictualist because there's tension. People want to see change in the way religion and state bodies interact in their relationship. So I take this idea and I put it in a table here. I want to provide some examples for these more abstract concepts. So looking up the top left-hand quadrant here, we see the United States. So the United States is differentiated, meaning there is an official legal separation in the Constitution between religion and state, separation of religion and state. Now, this doesn't mean that religion might not be able to influence the state in other ways, such as lobbying groups or other things like that. But officially, from a legal standpoint, there's official separation of religion and state in the United States. Now, if we look to the right, to Kemalist Turkey, a little bit of background. Kemalist Turkey refers to Turkey under a man named Mustafa Kemal. Right after World War I in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire that had been in place for centuries collapsed, and a man named Mustafa Kemal basically set about ripping religion straight out of public life. So he established a secular constitution, banned various forms of religious expression in the public sphere. And so he did this secularization effort, but a lot of people in Turkey were not happy about it. So there's this idea of conflictualism because a lot of people wanted to change the new terms of the relationship between religion and state in Turkey. So if we look at the bottom half of the table, we see integrationist states. So perhaps two of the most famous examples of integrationist states today are Iran and Saudi Arabia. Both have Islam established in their constitution as their official religion, also impose various religious laws. So very close connection between religion and state in Saudi Arabia and Iran. Look to the right, Afghanistan, also an Islamic state officially in their constitution, but there's a segment of the population, notably the Taliban, who would like to change that status quo, go back to the way things were before 2005 with the more strict interpretation of Islamic law. So while the Taliban is certainly on a majority of the population, there's this idea of conflictualism and that the Taliban would like to change the current status quo between religion and state in Afghanistan. All right, so this brings me to my theory. So remember, I'm answering this question of does the relationship between religion and state influence the state's behavior towards other states, particularly does it make religious states like that more aggressive? And so I take this idea of religious communities and religious identity and how that may affect states' behavior, and I apply that to the interstate system. So first of all, religion generally serves as a source of identity that motivates the formation of groups. So religious communities, they draw their sense of identity not only from their religious beliefs themselves, but also from the fact that they tend to publicly dissociate or reject other groups that don't share their same religious beliefs. And one of the chief ways that they demonstrate this dissociation from religion and state. Just like any other religious group, they're going to rely on religion as a source of legitimacy for their government. They're also going to claim that their system of religious belief is superior to all others because they believe that their religion is the one true religion. And because of that, they're going to act aggressively toward other states to solidify their identity as the righteous victors and agents of God against those who subscribe to false or no religious beliefs. So all this brings me to the main idea that this process basically reinforces the state's religious identity and supposedly bolsters its claim to legitimacy in the eyes of its own people and other states as well. So basically what the integrationist state is trying to do is trying to send a message to various audiences that it's religiously legitimate. So there are three possible audiences that integrationist states could be sending their message to. First of all, they could be signaling to their own people or their constituents that they're dedicated to the common cause of upholding these religious beliefs and standards. So, for example, 1979, there's a man named, he was the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, and basically what he did was he preached a bunch of very fiery rhetoric against the United States, very aggressive rhetoric, and basically he rallied the Iranian people to his cause, and he was instrumental in overthrowing the US-backed Shah in Iran in 1979. So, although that's not an example of state aggression, that is an example of how aggressive rhetoric, at least, or aggressive movements like that can rally others to your cause. So that's the first way. That's the first audience. The second audience that states may be signaling to is other states who share their same type of religion, that they're willing to engage in violence to demonstrate their common zeal for the cause. So Saudi Arabia, for example, they want to be seen as the leader of the Sunni Muslim world, so they may engage in aggressive behavior towards other states, such as Iran, to demonstrate the fact that they want to be seen as the champion of Sunni Islam by other states and sort of have other Sunni Muslim states in the area rally around them. That's the second way. The third way, the third audience is integrationist states may be signaling to their superiority of their faith to other states who do not share their same faith. So example, maybe going way back to Crusades, so the Christian Crusaders sort of wanted to portray this image of Christianity overcoming the inferior Islamic infidels and signaling it this way. So this leads me to my first hypothesis, which is that greater state integrationism, greater connection between religious state institutions leads the state to have more aggressive behavior. We've also got this element of conflictualism, which remember is people, a population not being satisfied with the status quo of the terms of the relationship between religion and state. In a conflictual integrationist state, the state is trying to use religion as a source of legitimacy, but the people are kind of hesitant to accept that as a source of legitimacy. So because the people are doubtful, the state takes additional measures to support its claim to religious legitimacy. And as we discussed, it's going to do this by acting aggressively toward other states. And so hopefully the integrationist state is thinking that the people will be inspired by its victories against other states in the name of its religion, and they'll be more inclined to view religion as a legitimizing aspect of that religion. So this leads me to my second hypothesis, which is that integrationism plus this idea of conflictualism leads to greater state aggression. And this is when compared to states that are integrationist and consensual. So to test my hypothesis, this is my research design. I'm going to go through the data. I adopt the quantitative approach, the large N approach. So basically what the quantitative approach does is it offers a wide variety of cases, over a wide variety of geographical regions. My unit of analysis is the dyad year, which is just any two given states MID stands for a militarized interstate dispute. And there's 4 aspects to this variable. So a MID can be a threat by one state against another, threat to use force. Second of all, it could be a display of force. It could be a use of force by one state against another, or it could be all-out war between the 2 states. So that's the variable I'm trying to predict. My independent variable, my explanatory variable, the main variable is religious integrationism, and I measured that through the religion and state data set. So that's the dichotomous variable. Either a state has an official religion or it doesn't. So that's how I measure religious integrationism. The secondary variable that I used to test my second hypothesis about conflictualism comes from the religious conflict in developing countries data set, which measures conflictualism according to 4 aspects, whether there's attacks on religious communities, attacks by religious communities on non-religious groups, clashes between security forces and religious groups, or clashes between 2 religious communities within one state. Also include several control variables that may also influence my dependent variables. So relative state power. If one state is a lot stronger than another, it may be more likely to attack, so I want to adjust for that in my model. Second of all, regime type. Studies have shown that democracies are generally a lot less likely, generally don't fight each other at all, so I want to adjust for whether a state is democratic or authoritarian. Third, contiguity. States border each other. States that border each other, because they're so close to each other, generally will have high degree of interaction, which also includes conflict, so I want to adjust for continuity as well. Lastly, gross domestic product, GDP per capita. Studies have shown that states with a low GDP per capita also tend to have a high rate of involvement in conflict, so I want to adjust for that as well. For my analytical model, I utilized the Bollinger Regression Model. My dependent variable is dichotomous, not continuous, and I cluster my standard errors by dyad. So here are my results. So we're looking at what's statistically significant here. We have obviously the control variables, contiguity, very statistically significant. Regime type, statistically significant. Relative power as well. If you look up at the top, integrationism, that's my explanatory variable. We see that only the threats in the MID data set are statistically significant here. So hypothesis 1 is partially supported. The findings are not very robust, but we see that at least states that are integrationists tend to, we see, make threats more than other states. So this is the second results table for my second hypothesis on integrationism and conflictualism. There's this table here, but it's easier to see in the form of this graph. So on the y-axis here, we have the probability that a state will initiate a militarized interstate dispute. And on the x-axis, we have consensual and conflictual states. So we see that the integrationist consensual state has about a 0.001% chance of initiating a MID, whereas the integrationist but conflictual state has about between a 0.003 and 0.004 chance of initiating a MID, which means that integrationist conflictual states are about 5.6 times more likely to initiate a MID than an integrationist consensual state. So hypothesis 2, that integrationism plus conflictualism leads to more aggressive behavior, that hypothesis is supported. So implications, summary, hypothesis 1, partially supported. Threats on the MID variable were statistically significant for integrationist states. Hypothesis 2 is supported. Integrationist conflictual states tend to initiate a MID at a 5.6% higher rate than consensual integrationist states. Main takeaways from this study, we need to see that integrationist states, they're going to be acting aggressively towards other states. They may not be very interested in reaping the material benefits of conquest of whatever state they're acting aggressive towards. Rather, they may be acting second of all, we see from the fact that threats on the mid variable were statistically significant, that integrationist states often perceive that making threats, just making threats in and of itself, will be sufficient to satisfy this extra need for legitimacy that they have in the eyes of their target audience. And third, policy implications. So integrationist states should know that initiating a MID may be one way to bolster their internal legitimacy, especially for integrationist conflictual states. But again, my study doesn't provide any conclusive evidence as to whether making that threat will actually boost their legitimacy in the eyes of their target audience. Second of all, secular states just need to be aware that conflictual integrationist states in particular may be exhibiting this aggressive behavior, and that's probably because they have a need for internal legitimacy. So opportunities for further research to improve the robustness of my study. Only a small number of militarized interstate disputes were included in the study, and that's just due to the very restrictive criteria that I'm looking at in the study. Second of all, we could use variables other than official religion to test the hypotheses. So in my study, I used official religion that's the only variable I used to test whether a state is integrationist or differentiated. The problem with that is that a state like England, which technically has an official religion, the English Church, versus Saudi Arabia, which also has an official religion, those states, I place both of them in the same box, basically, which is a bit of a problem because obviously religion plays a very different role in England than it does in Saudi Arabia. So other variables to measure integrationism, such as maybe persecution of religious minorities or religious laws that are enforced in the public sphere, may help in defining or measuring integrationism. And so secondly, we could test the three causal mechanisms. Remember the three target audiences that regimes may be signaling to. So further studies could test which of these audiences integrationist states are signaling to. And lastly, certainly opportunities for qualitative research, that is going to particular case studies and really examining them to see if my